these sessions very interesting, very helpful. But I feel that the participation, especially from the fellows, is kind of lacking. So I want you guys to come forward, interact, ask questions. It's basically ultimately for you. So I know we end up discussing amongst ourselves, and I don't think that was the whole purpose of this of this session to be started. I see a lot of fellows do log in religiously, and but I feel they're like silent spectators in the background. And as Pranjal has been requested previously, also it's good to have videos on so that we can see the faces also. So with that, I think I just have a privilege of introducing today's faculty. So Manas has kindly agreed to mentor and moderate today's session. Dr. Manas Kalra is a consultant of hematology oncology at Sir Gangaram Hospital, Delhi. We have a esteemed panel of experts today. I think he's done a great job in getting all of them together on the same platform. Professor Rachna Seth, she doesn't need introduction to this audience. She's a professor and head of pediatric oncology at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi. So good afternoon, ma'am, and thank you for taking time out to come and share your experiences today. We have Professor Sridhar, who is an oncopathologist at TMH, very accomplished senior colleague. We have Dr. Vineet Pant, who's a consultant nuclear medicine at Fortis Hospital, Gurugram. And we have Dr. Badra, who is our colleague, assistant professor, pediatric oncology at TMH, Mumbai. And Dr. Pallavi, she's a senior FNB fellow at the Sir Gangaram Hospital, and she's going to be presenting today's case. So as usual, we have divided this into two components. Dr. Badra is going to give overview of how to approach ambidextrous mass, and then we'll have some case discussions following that on Hodgkin's lymphoma. So over to you, Manas, and we'll get going. Thank you very much for all logging in. And as I said earlier, I request if you could just put your videos on, it would be really good. And I also request all the fellows and the trainees to participate and ask questions in the chat box and otherwise also when the case discussions are on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. I'm sure the whole team of ECO and PHO chapter is putting in a lot of effort to get this academic thing going on, and it has been quite well in the last 2 weeks that two important topics have been discussed and a lot of good attendance from all the PHO fellows. So we have lined up 2 sessions. First one is the lecture. Dr. Badra is going to start that, and that is on approach to mediastinal mass. So I request if Pranjal can, initiate that. I think Dr. Badra, you are co-host, so you can share your screen and start the presentation on the approach to mediastinal mass. And this will be followed by cases on Hodgkin lymphoma.
So I'll share the screen, Manas. Is the screen visible?
The screen sharing, but we can't see the slides yet. We can't see the slides yet, but we can see that you're trying to share your screen.
Okay. Just a minute, I'll go once more.
Yeah, now we can see it.
Okay, sure.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Now can see.
So very good evening to everybody. So as a pediatric oncologist, we would have come across children with mediastinal mass every now and then, and I'm sure it would have put us all in a tricky position some point or the other. So this one is a very brief PPT, which will just give you an overview of how to approach a mediastinal mass, what a bit of detail and attention we should actually give with regard to the diagnosis, workup, and the management of these patients. So if you put it, the mediastinum is actually the space and the structures which are situated between the two lungs from the first rib to the diaphragm. So again, it is anatomically compartmentalized into a superior mediastinum from above the sternal angle to the first rib, and an inferior mediastinum from below the sternal angle to the diaphragm. And this inferior mediastinum is again divided into an anterior, middle, and posterior mediastinum. It is actually, you can remember it with reference to the heart. Heart is the middle, anything anterior is the anterior, anything behind is the posterior. So this compartmentalization, it helps us to know the structures within each compartment, and it will give us, in a case of mediastinal mass, an etiological clue, because we can see the epicenter or the site of origin of the mass. Not only that, because when we know the site of origin, it will also help us understand the etiology or the probable causes for the mediastinal mass in children. So in that way, this compartmentalization is very helpful to know what constitute or what are the structures that you see. So in the superior mediastinum, the main contents are thymus. You have the great vessels, the aorta, the brachiocephalic veins. Then you have nerves and thyroid tissue, especially if there is a retrosternal extension. In the anterior mediastinum, the main contents are again the thymus. You have the lymph nodes, you have the thyroid and the internal thoracic vessels. The middle mediastinum is mainly the heart suspended in the pericardium, and also you have the mediastinal nodes, lymph nodes there. And in the posterior mediastinum, it is mainly the esophagus and the neural tissue, mainly the sympathetic chain and the ganglia there, and the thoracic duct also. So this compartmentalization, it is not very cut and hard. So you can have a mass which originates from the anterior going into the middle, a middle mass into the anterior or the posterior, but the bulk of the mass still stays in the site of origin. So that is helpful for us. So in this session, we'll be mainly concentrating on the malignant part of it, the malignant masses. There are a lot of benign masses too. So when you look at the structures in the anterior mediastinum, we know thymus, so thymus enlargement can be there. We know there are lymph nodes, so then thymus. So the main lesions which can arise in the anterior mediastinum, they are the lymphomas and the leukemias, especially the T-cell leukemias, because thymus, as you know, is the maturation of the T-cells takes place there. So it's mainly the T-cell leukemias that you can find there. Primordial germ cells, which aberrant migration can be seen in anterior and the middle mediastinum. So the germ cell tumors are another important cause for the mediastinal masses in children. So mainly teratomas, yolk sac tumors, choriocarcinomas, and mixed germ cell tumors. In the middle mediastinum, as I've said, it is mainly the heart and the great vessels. So even lymphoma, leukemia, and the mediastinal lymph nodes. So they can also be enlarged in lymphomas, especially the Hodgkin lymphomas. You can have paratracheal, pretracheal lymph nodes, or you can have cardiac tumors because the heart is the main structure there. You can have soft tissue sarcomas again, which are seen in the middle mediastinum, which spill over to the superior and the other compartments too. Mainly synovial sarcomas, the non-rhabdomyomatous soft tissue sarcomas can be seen here. Posterior, as I've said, is mainly neurogenic. So the main which we come across as pediatric oncologists are neuroblastomas arising from the sympathetic chain and the ganglia. You can also have, as I've said, bone tumors, especially Ewing sarcoma, which can arise either from the vertebrae or the posterior rib. So you can have chest wall Ewing sarcoma also. So these are the main malignant tumors. There can be a lot of benign masses also, but I'm not going into the details of those. So the clinical manifestations of a mediastinal mass. So some of these can be asymptomatic, especially when it comes to malignant diseases. Hodgkin's lymphoma is one disease where even you can have a mediastinal mass or a mediastinal lymph node which is large enough, but they might remain asymptomatic in most cases. Then the mediastinal mass, the clinical manifestations are due to the local effects of the mass on the structures which are there in the mediastinum. And as I put before, it's mainly the vessels and the airway, the trachea and the bronchus, and many of these are compressible. So the mediastinal mass can either compress or can infiltrate in certain diseases and hence lead to local effects. So let's see what these local effects are, which are actually the clinical manifestations seen. So the most important one is the superior vena cava, you know. So it's a compressible structure. So any compression or infiltration, as you see in some diseases, can cause what is known as the superior vena caval compression syndrome. So what happens in this? Because the SVC is obstructed, there is back pressure, and SVC drains the face, head, and the upper part of the chest and the upper limbs. So because there is compression, there is venous stasis, back pressure, which can lead to either it's actually a spectrum of manifestations. It can lead to the full-blown SVC syndrome where there is congestion of the face, there is edema of the face, plethora, there is cyanosis, conjunctival suffusion, upper limb edema. And because of stasis, there is also collateral which is being developed between the tributaries of IVC and SVC. You can see dilated veins in the upper part of the chest. So this is actually a full-blown SVC. But you can even if the child doesn't have all these symptoms, always be careful that you should ask the symptom of dyspnea in the lying down position. So the patient may be comfortable in front of you, there is no tachypnea, but unless you ask the history whether he is having distress while lying down, you might miss it. So that is important when you take care of the patient. You should avoid lying in the recumbent and advise a proper position. Again, as I've said, trachea and the mainstem bronchus are the main structures. So any compression can cause airway obstruction and respiratory distress. So superior mediastinal syndrome actually refers to this compression of the airway, but SVC and SMS are usually used interchangeably and synonymously. So the constellation of symptoms will remain the same. Local effects can also cause effusion. So the effusion can be due to two causes. One is due to venous congestion. You can have pleural or pericardial effusion, or you can have due to disease involvement per se, as you see in lymphoma. Unless you do a pleural fluid or a pericardial fluid analysis, you would not be able to make out whether it is involved. But there are certain clues in imaging which can make out whether it is disease involvement or due to venous congestion. The other one is, as I've said, it is great vessels. There can be cardiovascular obstruction. There can be cardiac tamponade, outflow obstruction. The patient can have arrhythmias, syncope. Again, we should be very useful. It's an emergent situation which requires immediate intervention. So neural compression is another local effect, is especially seen in the posterior mediastinal mass. So as I said, there is sympathetic chain, sympathetic ganglia. So any lesion which involves the CAT1, especially the neuroblastoma, it can originate from there, or you can have a lower down which infiltrate that. So that will lead to Horner syndrome, CAT1. So you should look for the clinical features of those. Any other paraspinal paravertebral lesion like Ewing sarcoma or even neuroblastoma can have an intraspinal extension and can cause features of compressive myelopathy with paraparesis or the paraplegia and other symptoms with the progression. So these these are the local effects. Now the mediastinal mass is due to an underlying disease which might cause other constitutional symptoms also. Especially in lymphoma, leukemias, you can have fever, all other symptoms. Hodgkin's can cause weight loss, drenching, night sweats. So you have to look for other constitutional symptoms. Even Ewing's can have constitutional symptoms. So how do you work up a case of mediastinal mass? Now, etiological workup, like in any case or any case of, you have to start with history, clinical examination, and laboratory. So history also will provide you certain clues. Now, with regard to the age, so usually in less than 5 years of age, it is mainly leukemia is one of the cause, especially T cell. Then there is germ cell tumors, usually seen around 2 to 4 years of age. And most germ cell tumors at this age, mediastinal, are either teratomas or yolk sac tumors. You can also have neuroblastomas, the thoracic neuroblastomas. Usually they are of favorable biology, but the patient will be symptomatic because of intraspinal extension and compression. But mostly it will be a favorable histology with usually non-metastatic. 5 to 10 years, again, leukemia. You can have lymphoblastic lymphomas, and Hodgkin's lymphoma can also be seen in this age group. More than 10 years, again, lymphoma, leukemias, especially lymphoblastic leukemia with a mass and an effusion. Germ cell tumors, especially in males, you can have mediastinal non-seminomatous germ cell tumors or a pure choriocarcinoma. Then you can have Hodgkin's, which is one of the commonest in that age group. Then Ewing sarcoma, it can present as Askin tumors, chest wall PLNT. Soft tissue, again, synovial sarcoma, as I said, it's one of the age groups you can have in these patients. So duration again is important. Acute, usually lymphomas will have a 2-week history or a 3-week or 1 or 2 months maximum. Acute, subacute history. A chronic history usually can be seen in Ewing sarcoma. It can be seen in Hodgkin's lymphoma, history of 1 or 2 years. And other symptoms should also be looked into. Just as I said, leukemia, you can look for features of cytopenias and organ infiltrations causing organomegaly. There can be proptosis with orbital mets in neuroblastoma. Hemoptysis. So this is one symptom. Usually mediastinal mass, lymphomas, leukemias, they don't infiltrate the vascular structures. They usually cause compression. The two main tumors which usually causes infiltration of the vascular structures are soft tissue sarcomas and also germ cell tumors, especially the non-seminomatous germ cell tumors. So they can have hemoptysis if there is vascular infiltration. The other cause of a mediastinal lesion with hemoptysis you have to keep in mind is a non-malignant infectious cause like fungal. So fungal aspergillosis, such things can invade the vessels and cause hemoptysis. So that is one clue for an infiltration of the vascular structures. Then physical examination also gives you a lot of clues. As I've said, all these on the left side are features of leukemia. You can have all these features, particularly for the etiological workup, etiological clues. You can look at the eye. As I've said, any CA-T1 lesion, especially neuroblastoma, can cause Horner's. Usually they are favorable biology and may be associated with opsoclonus myoclonus. So if you have a patient with that, you have the clue in there. There can be generalized lymphadenopathy seen in leukemias. There can be bulky lymph nodes seen in Hodgkin's lymphomas. There can be features of SVC syndrome. So there can be effusions with diminished movement of one side of the chest due to pleural effusions. There can be neural compression. Cord myelopathy can cause paraplegia. There can be, so the patient may not be moving the lower limbs. There can be organ infiltration in leukemias causing organomegaly, hepatosplenomegaly, and abdominal distension. You should also look at the testes, which can be involved due to both leukemia, and maybe you can also have a germ cell tumor there. Skin rashes. So these are basically with respect to the particular etiology of the mediastinal mass. Also, you should keep in mind that you also have to look for other clues like around one third of the children, adolescent children, more than 11 years who present with a mediastinal GCT can have Klinefelter syndrome. So you can look for evidence of that. And also neurocutaneous markers, especially Café au lait spots. You can see it both in neurofibromatosis where there is increased incidence of neuroblastomas and also leukemias. And the other lesion, other syndrome where you can have Café au lait spots is CMMRD, constitutional mismatch repair deficiency syndrome. It is also a genetic predisposition syndrome where the patient can have increased vulnerability to leukemias. Because this is from the genetic counseling point of view, if you find that, you have to work up for that. So now coming to the diagnosis of this. So we all know that lab investigations have to be done. There are both ancillary investigations which gives us clues and directs us towards particular investigations to be done for definitive diagnosis. So these main ancillary investigations are, you can do a CBC with differential and peripheral smear. So it will give out any blasts, cytopenias which can be seen. So then if that is there, you just have to, and if there is hyperleukocytosis, you can just do a flow on the blood or the bone marrow for a definitive diagnosis. And if you have blasts, again, you can do a bone marrow or a blood, and you need not go with a mediastinal mass biopsy. So always in a mediastinal mass, you should look for any alternative ways by which you can get a diagnosis done rather than doing a direct mediastinal mass biopsy. So this is helpful in there. You look at the TLS parameters, especially in these patients, monitor for TLS. If TLS is there, especially your first differential would be lymphoma and the leukemia. Some cases, neuroblastoma can be LDH. High LDH again points towards leukemia. It's also tumor markers are important. We are suspecting an anterior mediastinal mass and GCT is suspected. So if you have an elevated tumor marker, AFP or a beta SCG or combined, you need not proceed with the mass biopsy for definitive diagnosis. A mediastinal mass with elevated tumor marker, the diagnosis is done. You can proceed with therapy there. So the most important investigation is imaging that we'll be doing. First one is the chest X-ray, and the chest X-ray will just give us a clue whether there is a mass and associated effusion. For more characterization, you will have to go for a definitive imaging, mostly CECT. MRI takes a lot of time to get processed, even though it has better soft tissue resolution. And keeping the patient, if he has, especially if the patient has SVC syndrome in the recumbent, is dangerous. So we would do with the CECT. Wherever PET-CT is available, you can go for a PET-CT if you're suspecting solid tumors, because that would complete the workup also. But this all should be directed according to your prelim investigations. Again, for a definitive, I've made the point clear. The point is, if you have an alternative way to arrive at a diagnosis, please proceed with that. You don't have to go for a mediastinal mass biopsy on a definite basis. So if there is features, you can do flow. So if there is effusion, you're suspecting a lymphoma, you can even send a flow from the pleural or the pericardial fluid when you drain it. Tumor markers are there positive, no need for biopsy. So biopsy, if you can do biopsy from different areas. If there is generalized significant lymphadenopathy, you can do the biopsy of the peripheral lymph node via a local or a regional block. If there is no way available and you have to do a mediastinal mass biopsy, I'll come to that, how to do. So the mediastinal mass biopsy, if a patient is older, you can, if it's possible under local anesthesia, you can do it under local anesthesia and light sedation. So this is in a non-intubated patient. An intubated patient, you can proceed with it in the ICU only. So the main thing is, because many of these are very chemosensitive, radiosensitive lymphomas and leukemias, you have to balance between the diagnosis and treatment, because on an emergency basis, you might have to start treatment, but every effort should be made on a daily basis, assessing the patient to get a definitive diagnostic biopsy or definitive diagnosis. So because even after 48 hours, the histology can change, the way it is can change. So it will not be able to arrive at a definite diagnosis in a lymphoma. So every attempt should be made in a real time for a definitive diagnostic procedure. So if you have to give anesthesia, the preferential principles are, you do the evaluation of the symptoms where the patient have all these features. You do an imaging, then you can see the CT tracheal cross section less than 50% is a high anesthetic risk, and it should be done under anesthesia by an expert anesthetist. So great vessel, pleural pericardial effusion, mainstem bronchus, all has been shown to increase the risk during the perioperative period. So the principles of any invasive procedures, least invasive methods to be followed or alternate methods, minimal sedation anesthesia, try to maintain spontaneous ventilation, avoid muscle relaxants, an expert anesthetist with immediate availability of airway manipulation techniques, and as I've said, timing of biopsy. If immediately you can't do, start off the treatment and make an attempt every day and possibly within 48 hours to get a diagnosis. So there's a certain imaging which gives us a diagnostic tools. I've put up a few of these cases. So the most important thing is, especially in asymptomatic children, as you know, during physiological thymus enlargement can be there, especially in early childhood, and thymus is maybe enlarged till puberty, after which it involutes. So there may be masses which are incidentally detected on imaging done for other purposes. So one of the common scenario is this thymic enlargement with a Sale sign. You can see the thymus sitting into the lobar fissure. So you need not, it's important to differentiate this because you need not embark on any other fancy investigations after seeing this X-ray. So this is another case who have come. You can see there is pleural effusion. There is a homogeneous opacity on the right side. So these are two cases. So you can see here two cases with homogeneous opacity on the right side. Now whether this is a mass or an effusion is something, sorry. Whether there is a mass or effusion is something you can make out by doing an ultrasound or a CT. So for this patient, we have a CECT here. You can see a mediastinal mass here. And you can see this is the density of a fluid. So this is pleural effusion. This is most likely a lymphoma. So this is another case with such a opacity. So when a CT was done, you can see here, there is a homogeneous mass. And if you look at the bones here, this is a bone window of a CT. So whenever you look at the CT, it's not just the mediastinum you have to look. You have to look at the mediastinum, you have to look at the lungs, you have to look at the bones. The radiologists do it in a stepwise manner because we often tend to focus on the mediastinum and just run away from there. So this CT is a bone window, and if you can see here, you can see this rib is destroyed. So the epicenter of the lesion is the rib. So that's most common diagnosis is a Nebbing sarcoma. So if you get a clue from this, it is easier to give the chemotherapy and manage from there on. So this is another case with a mediastinal mass. So you can see it is not just a single mass. You can see there are like multiple masses. And this is usually the case you see in Hodgkin's lymphoma. You can see a mediastinal mass. You can see a paratracheal lymphadenopathy. They're usually not symptomatic for the mass, despite the X-ray making us, making us panicky. So this is another patient. You can see a mediastinal mass. This is an anti-mediastinal mass. So the clue between anterior and posterior is one, you can do a lateral X-ray and find out. Even in anterior, so this is an anterior and posterior, you can see, because there is air in front, you can see the cardiac shadow very clearly. So this is a clue that this lesion is actually posterior. Here you can't make out the cardiac shadow properly, so that means the lesion is in the anterior. So this is an anterior mediastinal mass. And if you look at the CT here, you can see the mass, you can see some calcification there, you can see a fat shadow there. So this is most likely a teratoma. If the tumor markers are normal, it's a mature teratoma and surgery is the treatment. If the tumor markers are elevated, it's a mixed germ cell tumor. You might have to start with chemotherapy. Again, this is another lesion. Here also you can see there is a heterogeneous lesion with peripheral enhancement, some necrosis. But the thing is, if you look at the lungs, there are also mets in there. So it's imperative that you don't miss out on those. You have to look at the mediastinum, the lungs, the bones, because all these are clues. So this, as I've said, is a posterior mediastinal mass. You can see on this a lot of calcification there. And so intraspinal extension cannot be made out on this. You have to do an MRI for that. So this is most likely a neuroblastoma. So this is just the management, how to broadly manage a mediastinal mass. So as I've said, it may be part of a broader disease process like a leukemia and a lymphoma with other these things. So if there is other hyperleukocytosis, cytopenias, you have to manage that. One thing I want to point out in hyperleukocytosis is the patient has hyperleukocytosis and it's due to malignancy. And if the patient has a mediastinal mass, if it doesn't cause SVC syndrome, you can go and hyperhydrate the patient along with cytoreductive therapy. But if the patient with hyperleukocytosis is having a mediastinal mass with SVC or SMS, it's a double-edged sword. You have to be careful with your hydration. You may not put in on full 120, 3 liters per meter squared per day, but you can start around a little above the maintenance, start off cytoreductive therapy and the other anti-TLS measures, and then take it from there on a real-time basis. You also have to look at the metabolic complications, the TLS, which might come with leukemia and lymphoma, and manage accordingly. Now, local effect, so because you may not be able to maintain hydration in patients with SVC, they might have to go in for dialysis at an early stage or so that has to be taken care of. So with regard to the local effects, as I've said, SVC is one of the most commonest complications. Position is very important, especially when you take the patient for imaging, when the patient, you change the bed sheet. You know, if it's a big mass, even a moment of lying down in a recombinant position, it could cause collapse of the patient, and you might lose the patient at that point of time if the patient is not intubated. So you have to be very careful about the position, propped up, left lateral position if possible. IV always in the lower limb when to start with, because if you put again in the upper limb and give fluids, that will again increase the back pressure, stasis, and the symptoms of the patient. So you should be careful for an IV in the lower limb. Fluid management, as I've already said. So chemotherapy, you might have to start your chemotherapy on an emergency basis for a patient with SVC syndrome, pending investigations and diagnosis. So chemotherapy, usually if you're suspecting lymphoma, you start off. Peripheral smear is also showing blast. So you can start off with dexamethasone, which would be better, or IV, because the patient will not be able to take orally. So steroids, if it's not lymphoma, leukemia also, you can start steroids, because if there is SVC, it will decrease the edema there. So you can start at a lower dose there also. So you can also give definitive chemotherapy in cases where you are suspecting, if you're suspecting a solid tumor, like Ewing sarcoma with a bone destruction there, or a neuroblastoma, you can start the definitive chemotherapy also. So if you're not, if you are not confirmed that which type of a malignant tumor is there, but it's a solid malignant tumor with malignant features, you can give off a course of vincristine, cyclo, and doxorubicin, because doxorubicin works well in all solid tumors when the suspicion is of malignancy on the imaging and you don't have a definitive diagnosis. So most of the cases, we do away with radiation these days. Earlier, they used to do radiation because many of these are chemosensitive, and with imaging, we are better able to get a etiological clue. We usually start with chemotherapy. Radiation is not usually given unless in a neurologically compromised child where you might have to give a small dose of radiation, especially if it's an acute neurological compromise, not a long-standing one. Surgery also again depends upon the lesion. If it's a teratoma, you have to go for surgical correction, and surgery again, a decompressive laminectomy might be taken into consideration for a mediastinal posterior mass with cord compression, where chemotherapy has not resolved the symptom or didn't improve the symptoms in a 2-day period. So again, tracheal pulmonary compression, have to take care of the airway, chemoradiotherapy. Effusions, it's better to put in a drainage, an ICD or a pigtail, because they are going to reaccumulate in the first few days and you don't want to tap them again and again.
Badira will try to wrap up now.
Sure. So cardiovascular, so neural compression, as I've said, you can do it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
You wrapped up really early. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to the cases. That was a very nice presentation by Dr. Badira, and she has really set the stage for us to move on to Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is the topic for our case discussion today. She's, kind of shown you the entire spectrum of the mediastinal tumors that we see in childhood. And now we'll concentrate on Hodgkin lymphoma. And we've been asked to speak on diagnosis and staging only. So we'll not be going into the treatment, and we won't be discussing the treatment aspects of Hodgkin lymphoma. We will focus mainly on the diagnosis and staging. And for this purpose, we have very eminent panelists with us, Professor Rachna Seth from AIIMS, Professor Sridhar from Tata Hospital, Dr. Badira, who spoke about the mediastinal masses, and Dr. Vineet Pant from Fortis, who is a nuclear medicine consultant. So we'll start with the case presentation, and for this, I have Dr. Pallavi Sachdeva, who is senior fellow with us at Gangaram Hospital, and she'll be presenting 3 different cases in this presentation, and the main highlight would be to look at the diagnosis, the staging, and how PET scans are used to kind of interpret the response to treatment whenever we are monitoring that, and because that is very important aspect of management in patients with Hodgkin lymphoma. So we'll concentrate on these things, and over to you, Dr. Pallavi.
Sir, I can't see your screen.
Okay. I thought I shared my screen. Is it not visible?
Your screen is blank, Manas. I mean, there is no slides there. We can see you're trying to share, but there's no presentation there.
You can stop your share and start share screening again.
Okay. Because I could see this, but I don't know why I can't project it.
Yeah, we can.
Now it's fine.
Okay. So we are going to discuss cases on Hodgkin lymphoma, diagnosis and staging. So we all know that Hodgkin lymphoma is a neoplasm of lymphoid tissue that is defined histopathologically by the presence of RS cells, Hodgkin cells, lymphocytic cells, and histiocytic cells. And there is a polymorphous inflammatory cell population which is visible in most of the Hodgkin lymphoma cases. And we know that pediatric Hodgkin lymphoma is unique because in developing countries, we see more of children in the younger age group. There is a more male representation in our cohort. More patients have stage 3 and stage 4 disease. And a lot of patients have B symptoms as compared to the Western countries. And we'll see that in the cases that we are going to present. So Pallavi, if you can see the slides now, you can start with the cases, please.
For the first case, we have a 11-year-old boy who presented with history of cough for 2 months, which was non-spasmodic, non-productive. There was history of swelling over the left side of the neck, which were further noticed over the right side of the neck and in right axillary region from last 2 months, and it was gradually progressive. There was history of fever from 14 days. It was intermittent high-grade fever documented up to 102 degrees Fahrenheit with no chills and rigors. There was history of loss of weight, which was 2 kg loss in last 2 months. And the current weight of the child was 40 kg. So it was 5% weight loss in last 2 months. There was history of loss of appetite, but no history of night sweats, no history of jaundice, loose stools, vomiting, swelling in other regions of the body, tubercular contact, or recent travel. On examination, child was afebrile, pallor was present, there was lymphadenopathy, and the lymph node groups involved were left upper cervical, right upper cervical, left axillary, right axillary. Right axillary measured the largest, that was 3 into 3 centimeter. All the nodes were firm, non-tender, non-matted. Liver was palpable 1 centimeter below costal margin. There was no splenomegaly.
So that was the case that we had, and this child presented with this history and examination findings. And you know, we are trying to talk about diagnosis and staging here. So we'll do each and every basic aspect of Hodgkin lymphoma. So I begin with asking Dr. Rachna Seth about B symptoms. What are B symptoms and what is the importance of presence or absence of B symptoms, ma'am? Ma'am, we can't hear you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible now.
So there are 3 B symptoms predominantly, which are characteristic both for Hodgkin's as well as non-Hodgkin's, but they are more particular or peculiar to the Hodgkin lymphomas. So one would be that there is a persistent fever more than 38 degrees centigrade for persistently 3 days, consecutively 3 days. Then there is history of weight loss to the tune of maybe more than 10% over the past 6 months. And there is a history of night sweat. So these are predominantly 3 three major B symptoms which characterize a lymphoma, and these have a prognostic significance. So studies have shown that any of the B symptoms will confer an unfavorable profile to that particular lymphoma. So whenever you stage or characterize a lymphoma, particularly the Hodgkin lymphoma, you label or stage it as either A when there is absence of B symptoms, and it will be characterized or classified as B when there is presence of B symptoms. So that is what A and B mean, and these are actually related to the release of cytokines, which could be of various types. They could be interleukins, or they could be TNFs, or various others. And these cytokines are responsible for these B symptoms as well as other symptoms also that accompany a patient in Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Thank you, ma'am. I think very nicely elaborated. Some of the initial COG studies use the criteria of 39-degree temperature. This was the famous BACOP study. This used the 39-degree criteria, but I think most of the newer criteria actually use the 38-degree criteria for temperature for calling it as a B symptom. So this is what we all use now whenever we talk about B symptoms. And as madam said that, presence of B symptoms most of the time stages the disease, and we kind of classify them in intermediate and high risk. Whereas those who do not have B symptoms come into the low risk category, like 1A, 2A here as well. In the German, sometimes they use 1B as well. And in the St. Jude's also 1A, 2A come into the low risk category. So whenever B symptoms are present, the prognosis is usually bad. Ma'am, would you like to tell us about what is significant lymphadenopathy? So whenever our students are examining lymph nodes, how do they know what is significant or not?
Yes, so peripheral or even sometimes central lymphadenopathy is very, very typical or characteristic for a patient of Hodgkin lymphoma. But there could be some variations in the lymphocyte predominant variety or in the classical Hodgkin lymphoma. But the lymph node involvement is very, very characteristic. But we have to take in account the size of the lymph nodes. So it's generally a significant peripheral lymphadenopathy. So any size more than maybe 1 or 1.5 centimeter in the cervical axillary, beyond that would be significant. It's a very, very gross comment that anything more than 1.5 centimeter would be significant, 1 or 1.5 centimeter. But they would be significant if they are in the inguinal areas, then of course they are more than 1.5 or 2 centimeter would be significant. Besides that, of course, your PET avidity, which you just shown, I was not aware of this slide, but then yes, PET positivity or PET avidity also has a role in the further characterization of the lymph node involvement. So it could be a small lymph node, but if it is highly PET avid, then of course it could carry a significance. But generally for clinical examination, till we don't have a PET, then any lymph node in the cervical or axillary region more than 1 centimeter is considered significant. More than 1.5 centimeter or 2 centimeter in the inguinal region. Any nodal size in the supraclavicular or epitrochlear, any size is important, is significant.
Very important that the supraclavicular and epitrochlear, any size is important, and they are taken as significant lymphadenopathy. So this was the classification by the Euronet, and the COG also uses something similar kind of a classification. And as ma'am said, more than 1.5 centimeter is taken significant in the COG studies. Any cluster of matted or adherent nodes, any enlarged supraclavicular, and any mediastinal lymph nodes. Below the torso, usually more than 1 centimeter. Again, FDG avidity helps to pick it. And for spleen and liver, if they have focal defects on an ultrasound or a CT scan, they are taken significant even if there is no PET avidity. So that is again something very important. And ma'am, about the classification of the lymph nodal areas, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so but this is important when we talk of staging. So any lymph node, any one single region, this diagram is a very, very typical diagram, and all of you all can see, and these regions are very clearly marked out. So what we have to understand is that if it is cervical and supraclavicular, we have to take it as one region. So one has to be very familiar of the anatomy of the regions that are involved. So this diagram is actually self-explanatory, but then we need to, once we examine the child, then we have to identify the nodes that are involved and sort of stage the patient. Clinical staging can be done. For example, if there are only cervical and supraclavicular nodes and no other peripheral nodes, in at least what can you can at least examine the inguinal or the popliteal nodes and in a physical examination. So you have to accordingly put the stage. So any node, single node on one side of the diaphragm, single nodal region on one side of the diaphragm puts him into stage 1. So any nodes on or more than one region on one side of the diaphragm will make it as stage 2. If it is on both sides of the diaphragm, it makes it into stage 3. So that is the importance of nodal involvement. I'm saying only on the basis of clinical examination. But everybody should carry this message that it is not only physical examination. We always stage the patient once we have the imaging. A lot of information comes after imaging, and it's not only by physical examination. So what is important on a peripheral physical examination is that you need to be familiar with the nodal regions and characterize the regions that are involved roughly on one side of the diaphragm or on both sides of the diaphragm. At least this much can be done on a clinical examination.
Thank you, ma'am.
And besides this, of course, you can also do a splenic examination and so on.
Sure.
For node, of course, that is what information, only that information comes from a physical examination.
Sure. So, how do we approach such a child who presents to us with lymphadenopathy? We start with the basic investigations, which is a CBC peripheral smear. Sometimes it can be just a leukemia, and you can pick it from there. You do a LDH level, we do a chest X-ray, and often an ultrasound abdomen is done. Sometimes it is useful, and sometimes it is just an additional investigation and does not yield much benefit. So in this particular case, Pallavi?
In this child, CBC showed high TLC and high platelet counts with neutrophilic predominance. Smear showed monocytosis also. ESR was high of 42 and LDH was slightly raised with 288 international units per liter. Chest X-ray showed paratracheal lymphadenopathy with left upper zone consolidation. FNAC was done outside and it had showed reactive changes. CT chest was also done outside and it had showed evidence for mediastinal mass involving middle mediastinum. And then the child was referred to us for further evaluation.
So at this point of time, when such a child presents to you, ma'am, what would be the best way of obtaining a tissue diagnosis? What is your preferred methodology at your center to make a diagnosis for this patient?
So in this child, we have good peripheral nodes as per the history that we have. So we'll go ahead with a biopsy. Choicest biopsy would be an excisional intact node biopsy. And due to logistics, sometimes because of non-availability of dates with the surgeons, we often have to resort to a sort of a core biopsy, which generally is a true cut biopsy. But the pathologists are not happy when we do a true cut biopsy. It distorts the architecture. Our choice of investigation to reach to a diagnosis is an excisional intact node biopsy. But this rule is otherwise not valid when you have a retroperitoneum or a mediastinum, where you cannot obtain an intact node biopsy and you have to go ahead with a true cut biopsy. FNAC we never go ahead with the FNAC unless it's a relapse case. So FNAC would be out. Excisional node biopsy is the choices for directly.
Dr. Sridhar, can you hear me? Dr. Sridhar?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. What is your comment about this inadequate biopsy issue, and how do you want us to send that tissue to you?
See, here, when your aim is to establish a primary diagnosis, as it been illustrated earlier, it should be always preferably an intact lymph node. Why? Because it gives a much better overview of the tissue architecture, which is very important in establishing a primary diagnosis of Hodgkin lymphoma. Why? As there are many kind of mimickers of the same, to avoid misdiagnosing, it should be an intact lymph node wherever possible. If you are dealing with an unaccessible site like mediastinum, retroperitoneum, or intra-abdominal sites, yeah, a core biopsy can be manageable.
Sir, if we take multiple cores of tissue from, say, the neck node, with a gun, if we give you 4-5 cores, will you be happy with that? No.
You say cervical lymph node?
Yes.
definitely be happy. Why? You need to understand that this will be a primary baseline diagnosis on which your next entire follow-up or treatment, everything will be based on that. So now you understand the biology of Hodgkin lymphoma much better than what you used to know a couple of decades earlier. There are so it is, and especially when you're dealing with Hodgkin lymphoma, you're dealing with children who are likely to have a very long disease-free period or response rate. So you tend to have a long follow-up period. So it's always advisable to have a full node biopsy so that at any point of time you can review back.
Okay. So whenever possible, do a full excision biopsy. Sir, would you like to comment on this? This is this patient's true cut biopsy specimen. What do you think this looks like?
So the first and foremost, like, when you do this biopsy, you need to see whether it is truly representing a lymph node or a kind of an adjoining soft tissue or not. So when you say a lymph node, so you need to be aware of a lymph nodal architecture. So if you assume this is representing a lymph node, this picture shows an complete effacement of the architecture by admixed population of cells. You can see predominant population are the small blue cells, which are represents a small mature lymphoid cells, interspersed with scattered large cells. So you can't make out much details of the nuclear features in those cells, but at least you can see that the nucleus is at least, if not 5 to 10 times the size of the mature lymphoid cells. So if you assume that mature lymphoid cells is around 10 micrometers, so the cells are around 50 to 60 micron size in diameter. So these are the polymorphous picture, especially in a child cervical node. Your first differential diagnosis will be a Hodgkin lymphoma.
Is there anything in this that you want to comment? Anything important for our students?
Yeah, so this is again a different areas, essentially emphasizing the same like polymorphous nature. It is not like uniformly having same cells, or it is a mixed population of cells, and nowhere you are seeing any preserved lymph nodal architecture. That is more important.
Okay, sir. And this immunohistochemistry shows.
Yeah. So when you have features like this in a kind of a child, when you have a differential diagnosis of Hodgkin lymphoma, your first panel, basic minimum panel, should include CD3, CD20, CD30, CD15, and PAX5. So this is the basic panel you can do. Wherever required additional panel, you can use it depending upon your availability and institutional practices. You can see here all the large cells which are more brown. Brown is the color which is given to that procedure of immunization. Rightly, yeah. Manas is pointing it out. What is more important about in 30 is like 30 is just an activation marker. So you should not only see the positivity, but you should always see the pattern of positivity. Essentially, Manas, can you go back to that the cell which you are pointing it out? Yeah. If you can see, there is a nice outline of the cell that is cytoplasmic membrane positivity, and you can see a dot which is much more darker, brighter, that represents a Golgi zone, perinuclear Golgi zone. So the typical pattern of immunopositivity for this will be a diffuse cytoplasmic membrane positivity along with dot-like accentuation of Golgi complex. This is CD30 positivity. What you see in the other side of the picture is PAX5. What is PAX5? PAX5 is a transcription factor for B cell differentiation. So this PAX5 positivity, you can see the large cells. You can make out that one. Can you? Yeah. That large cells are positive, and there are some background cells which are also positive. It tells you that these are all B lymphoid cells.
Okay. So that is CD30 positivity, PAX5 positivity, and this child was reported as Hodgkin lymphoma.
So at this point, what I wanted to emphasize is, so if you have any potential, you have established first is a B cell lymphoma with a polymorphous background, 30 positive. So you can say that you are dealing with an Hodgkin lymphoma. All the differentials are out. Because now to make further diagnosis, a bit of clinical information will be important, like whether this patient is having any mediastinal mass or whether it is having any kind of heterogeneity. Why it is important? Suppose you're dealing similar kind of picture, you're dealing with a young girl or a young girl. So we need to have other differential of primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma. So that is why you require an additional panel of marker. So one more, when you establish Hodgkin lymphoma, the other point is you need to see whether it's a classic Hodgkin lymphoma or a nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin. So just based on only 30 and PAX5, we will not be in a position to tell exactly whether Hodgkin lymphoma or nodular lymphocyte. But if you see in this report, there are other markers has been mentioned. What are the markers it has been given? There is negative for CD20. It is negative for LCA. These features helps you saying that this is features of classic Hodgkin lymphoma. So for any kind of an oncologist, budding oncologist, you have to make sure that you get a report from a pathologist with clear kind of terminology. Hodgkin lymphoma, without specifying whether it is classic or nodular lymphocyte predominant, it will be an incomplete report. So here with these features, you can assume that it's a classic Hodgkin.
So I think very important, CD20 negativity, LCA negativity has been highlighted by Sir, and that is what claims the diagnosis of a classic Hodgkin lymphoma in this child. So we know that the Hodgkin lymphoma classification has evolved, and now we classify it into a classical and a nodular lymphocyte predominant variant. Classic has got further 4 variants like lymphocyte predominant, lymphocyte depletion, nodular sclerosis, and mixed cellularity. As Sir said, that classical Hodgkin will be CD30, CD15 positive usually, and nodular lymphocyte will be positive for CD20 and LCA, and that is how we differentiate these two lymphomas. So again, these are some images from classical Hodgkin lymphoma, highlighting CD30 and CD15 positive lymphomas along with the Reed-Sternberg cells. And then there is the nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma, which is CD20 positive, and that can be seen in the image here where CD20 is positive. Sir, would you like to comment on this image of nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma?
Okay, so as Dr. Manas had said, like, what are the different subtypes of classic Hodgkin lymphoma? One need to be aware that lymphocyte-rich subtype of classic Hodgkin lymphoma has got the closest morphological features with nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma. That is why it is important to know the correct immunohistochemical profile for these tumors. What is the basic difference between these two? If you understand that basic, you can clearly remember the immunophenotype. In a nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma, you will have an intact differentiation program for B cell. Whereas in case of classic Hodgkin lymphoma, there will be an altered or kind of deformed or deranged B cell differentiation program. So whenever you see, Manas, can you go to the next picture? Manas, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So yeah, if you see here, you are seeing a picture which is predominantly all small lymphoid cells interspersed with these large cells. These are multilobated nuclei, but the nucleoli is not macro. It is more pushed to the closer to the membrane. These are typically called popcorn cell. The one which has been highlighted as an LH cells is called popcorn cell. If you say popcorn, that's a kind of this thing. But it is otherwise earlier used to be called as lymphohistiocytic cells, but these two terms are no more used now. It has been called as LP cell. LP cell is lymphocyte predominant subtype cell. So this is, though these are classically theoretically described for this, but this is not like typical feature of only nodular lymphocyte predominant. If you get FSAKI, so you need to have an immunochemical conformation. So can you? So what are the immunohistochemistry which will distinguish, which will be characterize your NLPHL? It will have CD20 and PAX5 positivity will be there. And if you run the other nuclear transcription factors like BOB1 and OCT2, all will be positive. So all the B cell markers will be positive with weak or absent CD30 positivity. That is the typical phenotype for nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma.
Thank you, sir. That is very important. So now we have made a diagnosis of classical Hodgkin lymphoma in this child. And Vineet, can you please point out the positive findings on the PET-CT for our students? Yeah.
Just for the benefit of students, this is a whole body PET-CT scan. It's always done in an isotropic mode. These are contrast enhanced studies, so and they are adequate for the size estimation also. So we can do all the staging criteria evaluation for this patient. Now, if we see this patient, there are we can see bilateral cervical supraclavicular lymph nodes, bilateral axillary lymph nodes. There is a huge, large, and mediastinal mass, and we can see the liver and spleen more or less look normal to me here, but we will see them in the delayed image. I mean, the rest of the images. Now we see that there are large axillary node and the mediastinal node, and there is a contiguous erosion in the lower image. If we see, there is a contiguous erosion of the sternum by the mediastinal nodal mass. Also, we can see that there are the pleura is thickened and there is some ill-defined pleural nodularity, especially on the right side. Probably a rim of pleural effusion is also present there. The mediastinal mass in the previous image looked like that it is more than 7-8 centimeters, so it should be a bulky disease. And maybe we can move on to the next slides. Yeah. So these are the sagittal images. This is the bone window, and we can see that there is no such a focal deposit in the bone to suggest that there is any obvious marrow lesion or any bony lesion there. And
Thank you, Vineet. So we have bilateral cervical, supraclavicular, axillary, mediastinal, abdominal nodes. We have FDG avid erosion of the sternum. We have pleural deposits, and we have some atelectatic changes in the lungs where there is pleural and pericardial effusion, and the liver and the spleen are enlarged, although there is no FDG uptake in the liver and the spleen. So how do you finally stage Hodgkin? So Badira, can you just tell us about how do we stage Hodgkin lymphoma? Madam has already elaborated upon stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4, the basic, philosophy behind staging. How can you, elaborate on that?
Yeah. The staging is usually based on the Ann Arbor classification. So now we have the modified Ann Arbor with the Kurzweil modification, where in addition to staging 1, 2, 3, 4, you also have the A, B, S, and E. So, and also bulky disease, the X. So you have to know in the Ann Arbor, it is E, S, and B. So you have to know in staging, it is E and S. So you have to know what's the definition of E. So stage 1 has rightly been put out. It is any lymph node region, a single site, a lymph node or an extra lymphatic on one side of the diaphragm. If there are 2 or more regions, lymph node or extranodal on the same side of the diaphragm, it's stage 2. If you have lesions on the opposite side of the diaphragm, it is stage 3. Stage 4. So any marrow involvement, liver involvement, and lung involvement, which is not an E, is always stage 4. And any disseminated involvement of an extra lymphatic organ, will also put it at stage 4. So these are the main staging criteria. It's Ann Arbor based. Now, earlier it was clinically also based. Now it's mainly staging is based on imaging.
Yeah. And how do we define bulky disease, Badira?
So the definition of bulky disease, so you always, in the case of Hodgkin's lymphoma, we should be aware that all the definitions, the treatment, the risk stratification, the staging, and the treatment should be taken into the context of the protocol which you are using and delivering. So the bulky disease is defined differently by the COG and differently by the Euronet, because COG uses the size criteria, the Euronet uses the volume criteria. So bulky, you can have peripheral nodes or you have a mediastinal nodes. For a COG, any peripheral lymph node, single or a conglomerate mass which is more than 6 centimeter in size, it is bulky. And for a mediastinum, if it is more than 1/3 of the internal maximum thoracic diameter. So that is bulky for COG. For Euronet, it is volume based. Whenever you have more than or equal to 200 ml of the volume, which is calculated based on the imaging, that is bulky disease.
Thank you, Badira. And this is very important for us to stage. Also important is to look at the Walde's ring. Usually we have to get the help of an ENT person to comment on that. The size does not matter for Walde's ring, and the FDG uptake also does not matter for the Walde's ring. Spleen, if you have lesions on the spleen, it is important because it is taken even if they are FDG non-avid. Liver lesions are important, pleura and pericardium. So if you have pleural effusion, pericardial effusion, usually it is because of the contiguous spread and it is considered as an E disease. And lungs, we have to really see whether it is contiguous or whether it is separate. So if there is a lymph node attached, like a hilar lymph node, and that is only extending into the lung, it is taken as a E site, and otherwise it is taken as a more than 3 lesions in lung at different areas are taken as a stage 4 disease. So as Badira said, it is very important to annotate every patient with as A, B. What are B symptoms has already been highlighted. It is important to look at what is the bulky disease definition by our protocol, and the common definition has been highlighted, and also to comment whether the patient has E disease or not. That is a single extra nodal site contiguous to the known nodal site. What about bone marrow? So Dr. Rachna, do you do bone marrow for all your patients with Hodgkin lymphoma, or is it only for few patients that you do bone marrow, or has PET completely replaced bone marrow for your patients with Hodgkin?
As a common understanding, Dr. Manav, goes that we should do for all unfavorable sites or advanced disease, bone marrow had to be done. But in our center, we have foregone the use of bone marrow examination. We use PET-CT as a surrogate marker for bone marrow involvement. So, I mean, I think many centers who have the facility of PET would not be doing a bilateral bone marrow examination for patients of Hodgkin lymphoma, and we did an in-house study also. It had a very high specificity and as well as a sensitivity. So we have just given up using bone marrow examinations totally for our patients of Hodgkin's.
What about you, Dr. Badira? Are you using bone marrow for your patients with Hodgkin lymphoma? So you're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, so many of the protocols which are currently already done, they do say bone marrow. So the recent analysis, there is a meta-analysis in 2011, and also a recent analysis of around 830 patients, which has shown that bone marrow PET can totally replace the bone marrow biopsy staging. Because anyway, Hodgkin's is also a patchy involvement. So doing a single site bone marrow will not actually pick up all the lesions. So PET has got a negative predictive value of 99.9%. So I guess.
So a lot of people are actually giving up on doing bone marrows, but still a lot of people continue to do bone marrow, especially for stages 2B and above. There is really no role of doing a bone marrow in stage 1A and 2A patients. And similarly, bone scan, if you have a good facility, you usually do not do a bone scan for these patients for the staging purpose. So coming back to our first case, so we have discussed this.
So Manas, may interrupt you. So if the chat box, I think there is one question which has been coming quite frequently. That is, the fever component of B symptoms.
Yeah.
What is a significant fever? Grade, duration, frequency. I know what you've just pointed out there is what is the definitions on
so we highlighted the I think some people may have joined little later. We highlighted the importance of temperature, and we showed that over the COG protocols now the temperature has evolved to unexplained recurrent fever of more than 38 degrees. Usually 3 days documented temperature of more than 38 degrees is considered as B symptoms with no other explanation like an obvious malaria, typhoid, or anything else going on in the patient. And that is what the B symptoms are. I hope that answers the question that is being.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think Badra was also chatting with them in the background. It's probably 3 days, what you said, right?
3 days.
Usually 3 days, okay? So
sometimes we are classical, sometimes be the classical Pell-Epstein type, but of course the B symptoms, of course it is just 3 days. That is the cutoff. And the grade is 38 degrees.
Yeah. So, we come back to our patient. So, when we evaluated the size, the mediastinum was bulky. The child had lymph nodes above and below the diaphragm. There were pleural deposits, there was pleural and pericardial effusion, and the bone marrow came out to be negative. So how would you stage this patient? So some would call this as stage 3B because there are B symptoms, would call it X because there is bulky disease, and would call it E because there is extra lymphatic site, which is a contiguous involvement, which is the sternum in this case, which was involved. However, there is another school of thought where they think that if there are too many E sites involved, then it can be considered as stage 4. There are pleural deposits, pericardial deposit, a sternal deposit. So some would also want to call it as a stage 4 disease. And that is how we would proceed in this patient. The treatment for 3B and 4B would not really differ in most of the protocols. So next coming is when you have classified the patient, you have made a diagnosis and you have done the staging. How do you risk stratify? And we are all aware that every country, every cohort that is doing Hodgkin lymphoma studies have got a different kind of a risk stratification strategy. Badira, would you like to comment on this slide of how most of the people across the world are risk stratifying their patients with Hodgkin lymphoma?
Yeah. So this is actually a broad and it gives you a better idea of the risk stratification across different groups. So again, I just want to clarify one thing clear, that whatever treatment you are using, the staging should use the staging and the treatment of the same protocol which you are going to follow. So broadly, so there are different criteria. So the broadly, if it's just stage 1A, 2A, and if you don't have any adverse features, like E, for example, if you take COG, if you have 1A and 2A without any extra lymphatic or bulky, it is low risk. If you have extra lymphatic and bulky, that becomes intermediate risk together with 1B and 3B, 2A. So in the difference between COG and the rest is, in COG, 4A is still intermediate risk, and stage 1B is intermediate risk. So in Euronet,
so the figure clearly highlights, if you have 1A, 2A, the blue dots, you are in low. If you are these, which is the yellow, that is you are intermediate, and these ones, the red ones, are the high risk. Similar way, in Euronet, they have a different classification, and you have to stick to whatever protocol you are using, and that particular stage goes into that particular risk stratification, and you use that particular protocol and radiation dosing and radiation timing based on that particular recommendation for that patient. Okay, so that is what is the gist of this slide, and I know that because of the lack of time, we will not be able to go into details of that.
No, but Manas, there's a good question. Dr. Vikrujit has asked that what is the staging used in India by most of the centers?
So, that is the next slide, Sunil. That is the next slide. So the INPOG HL1 study, the INPOG HL1 study, that was the I think the largest study done for Hodgkin lymphoma patient in India, used early stage as 1 and 2A and advanced stage as 2B and 3 and 4, and bulky disease along with that. And the usage of ABVD was there in this protocol, and there were different cycles and different number of cycles and different criteria for radiation for these patients, which was implied. And that INPOG HL1 protocol is available and has also been published in the PHOJ journal, and we can pick details from that. So it was just for the simplification and for the masses, for everyone to be included into the protocol. This simplified risk stratification was used. A lot of people use the Euronet classification and are following the Euronet protocol, and they will be classifying into TG1, TG2, and TG3 based on the guidance by the Euronet protocol. So we'll quickly jump on to the second and the third case. Now these will be quick because we have discussed the details of staging and the diagnosis. So we'll just quickly go through this, and we'll also concentrate on response assessment by PET scan in these two cases. So 9-year-old, Pallavi, can you take on from here?
Yeah, 9-year-old girl presented in September 2019. She had a history of around 1 year with history of swelling over right side of the neck, which was gradually progressive. She was worked up extensively outside. FNAC was done, only reactive changes were seen. Then over the time, she developed pain and ulceration over the swelling side. Again, she was evaluated, FNAC was done. This time it came out suggestive of tubercular scrophulodema, started on ATT, received ATT for 1 year, but symptoms were still persistent. Though there was no fever, night sweat, weight loss, loss of appetite, or TB contact. She presented to us with acute history of fever for 7 days, and the neck swelling and ulceration were there. So on examination, she was febrile. Local examination showed ulcerated wound in the right cervical region with right cervical lymphadenopathy. Systemic examination revealed liver 4 centimeter palpable, no splenomegaly. Chest X-ray was normal. CT chest was suggestive of cervical lymphadenopathy with the areas of necrosis. CT thorax was essentially normal.
Dr. Sridhar, can you comment on this, please?
Yeah.
Is Dr. Sridhar here?
Okay, what,
Yeah.
are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
So what you can see, this is a photomicrograph representing a portion of a lymph node. If you can make out in one edge of the picture, you can see a thick pinkish material. That's a fibrous capsule of the node. The similar kind of bands which are traversing into the parenchyma and making a kind of a compartment, or imbibing a compartmentalization to the node. We can see cellular areas which are separated by thick bands of fiber. It's like, kind of a sclerosing or sclerosing bands which are fibrous bands which is there. So this is one picture. And when you go into the cellular areas, what you can see an enriched population as we discussed earlier. You have large cells which you can't make out any nuclear feature. That's a kind of a mummified cell. Mummified cell means a cell which is undergoing apoptosis, not exactly underwent apoptosis. It's a mummified cell in a background with some kind of collagen bands which is there. What you need to understand is not all lymph node or kind of thing which kind of fibrous like that should be called as nodular sclerosis. But when you have an Hodgkin-like picture and you have a traversing bands imbibing a nodular architecture, whether complete or partial, the fibrous band should be a greenish color should have a greenish color birefringence pattern on polarizing microscopy. Those are the diagnostic features of nodular sclerosis. This picture, though, is a classic picture of nodular sclerosis. It does not give you too many diagnostic dilemma. But what are the other feature which has not been able to show in this picture is a lacunar cell. Though these are all theoretical questions for you all. Lacunar cells. The lacunar cells is a retraction of the cytoplasm, giving a lacunar space around it. So those are the ones which, when you see a lacunar cell along with a fibrous band, you should call that is a nodular sclerosis subtype.
Thank you for not asking me to point out the mummified and the lacunar cell. I was hoping that you're not going to do that. So, here I think there are some mummified RS cells, although I am not very sure.
See that? Yeah. The darker ones, the cells which are darker, and those ones. Yes. Those are mummified cells. You have any other pictures?
So yes, the IHC.
Yeah. So now you need to understand here, like you got the first thing is aim is not to get into a subgroup or subgrouping. Is first you need to establish the diagnosis of Hodgkin lymphoma. First is the aim is that. So what we, if you remember the first case when we discussed, you need to have a classic morphology with the immunophenotype. Here you can see 30 positivity has been brought out here, and some of the cells are positive for CD15 also. Manas, can you show up this 15? The brown here, So here we need to know that CD30 is a very good marker for Hodgkin lymphoma, whereas CD15 is not as that good, like because it does not have the same consistent pattern of positivity like CD30. It will have two cells, variable pattern, and also there will be a lot of other bystander inflammatory cells which can produce positivity for 15. So the pattern of positivity, you should be very careful for 15 to call something as positive in Hodgkin lymphoma. So milieu is, your picture is like Hodgkin lymphoma. Here the picture is showing 30 and 15 positivity. So you can see other markers which has been written negative for LCA. You can see that. So it's a classic picture of Hodgkin lymphoma. First, you establish the diagnosis of classic Hodgkin lymphoma. And because of the other fibrous bands, it's a nodular sclerosis type. So if you want to go further prognostication, you can say it is grade 1 or grade 2. So grade 1, this picture is grade 1. Grade 2 is likely to have an aggressive or bad biology, which though WHO has not recommended in this current classification.
Thank you, sir. So this is nodular sclerosis, Hodgkin lymphoma, and we can see the sad state of affairs. This child has been unwell for the last 2 years and now presents with Hodgkin lymphoma. How do you differentiate from ALCL, sir, which is another common differential for Hodgkin lymphoma? What should our PGs know about how to differentiate Hodgkin from ALCL?
Okay, so most of the time you have a differential that is an histologically differential. If I'm not wrong, clinically you rarely have such diagnostic dilemma between differentiating ALCL and Hodgkin. So
definitely
I think
not in this case where the history is so long. Yes.
So long, yes. So many times the history, if you are well aware of the history, you can be very comfortable in calling something as Hodgkin lymphoma. But if you don't have an access to the history, or if there are certain instances where you have a diagnostic dilemma, you need to stick to the panel. Whenever you get PAX5 positivity, it is almost like almost 99 times saying that this is not an ALCL because of B cell lymphoma, PAX5 positivity. So ALK positivity is the confirmatory test for your identifying ALK positive ALCL, whereas you can use other B cell markers to distinguish between ALCL and classic Hodgkin lymphoma. In ALCL, the problem because positive, but you can demonstrate LCL. So in instances where you have diagnostic challenges with ALCL, you need your panel to have at least PAX5, ALK1 in your initial panel.
So if you have PAX5 positivity, then it points more towards Hodgkin. And if you have ALK positivity, it points more towards ALCL.
So in almost always, like when you have PAX5 positivity, you should never think of ALCL.
Yeah. Okay. So that is very important. Moving on to the PET-CT findings in this child. Vineet, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah. This is again a whole body PET-CT scan. On the image on the right side is the MIPT image, and this is the fusion image. So here we can clearly see there is a large conglomerate nodal mass. Now this definitely looks more than the 6 centimeter. Now I was seeing the question which were going on in the chat behind discussion. Now this is a bulky nodal conglomerate mass, the single mass which is more than definitely 6 centimeters.
Yeah.
Now can we proceed to the another images? There is, in this image, we can also see that there are lesions which were seen on the spleen and liver. Now, these are the axial image of the spleen and liver. There is large lesions seen in the spleen. And if we see again in the left lobe, this must be the segment 2 of the liver, which is just in front of the stomach. There is a small lesion which is showing, which is FDG-AB. So this is there is a large cervical nodal mass, which is definitely bulky. We have lesions in the liver. We have lesions in the spleen. And that's it. And maybe probably, yeah. Now again, these are the sagittal images. These are fused images in the bone window. We again are not showing any discrete lesion in the bone. So again.
So thanks, Vinny. So this patient, we can see lesions in the liver, in the spleen, and in the neck, the huge one. The bone marrow aspirate and biopsy was done, which was not infiltrated with lymphoma. Although the PET scan did say that there is a skeletal uptake, so there is a chance that there may be a Hodgkin in the bone marrow. But as we say, it is a patchy involvement. We could not document in the bone marrow. So this child had a stage 4 disease. Now, why we have said this is as A? Pallavi, do you want to comment of why you have called this as stage 4A, not B?
Because over the course of illness, she never had a history of fever. And when she presented to us with it was acute onset of fever, that may be because of ulcerated wound infection in the ulcer. So we didn't consider it as a B symptom.
She had pus pouring out of that lesion. Yeah. She had pus pouring out of that lesion, and we were not really sure. And that history of fever was just for 5-6 days and not for the last 2 years. And we just chose it to call it 4A, although somebody may want to call it 4B, and X because there was a bulky disease. So this child was given ABVD, and a whole body PET was repeated after 2 cycles. Vineet, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, now if we see the comparative images, if we remember the previous image, again, this is the sagittal image in which the bulky nodal mass has definitely much more regressed than what it was previously. Now, if we see the response assessment, we have the CT criteria, we have the PET criteria. If we go to the PET criteria, now we need to remember the dual score. Now, if there is no uptake in the mass, this is dual score 0. Now, with mediastinum and all those, can you see this? This is the normal blood pool activity which is in the liver and the spleen. We need to measure the blood pool activity of the mediastinal blood pool mass. We need to see the SUV max of the liver. On that base, we will decide what kind of dual which we will keep the lesion in. Now, if the uptake is less than the mediastinum, it goes to the 2. If it is more than mediastinum but less than liver, it goes 3. If it is moderately increased than the liver, it is 4. And if it is more than twice or thrice, which is much more than increased in the liver, then it goes 5. There's one more category X, which is not lymphoma, but I think that's irrelevant. Whenever we're doing PET CT, we can characterize whether the lesion is lymphomatous or not. So another, the dual, according to the dual criteria, it is either 1, 2, or 3. Both will be considered as complete metabolic response. On visual, it looks like a 2, so I'll call it a CMR.
So this patient had a dual score of 3 with a SUV of 3.1. Spleen, no metabolic activity, liver, no FDG activity, and the rest of the body had a metabolic CR. So we took it as a complete response in this patient after 2 cycles of ABVD. So I think the case was mainly to highlight the staging and also how to interpret the response. Pallavi, would you like to quickly go through the last case?
Yeah, the third case is of a 10-year-old boy who presented in September 19. He had history of swelling over left side of the neck in June 2017, around 1.5 years. Then there was history of fever on and off from last 6 months, which was undocumented fever, though there was no history of weight loss, appetite loss, or night sweats. On examination, there was left cervical lymph node mass around 5 into 5 centimeter with classical rubbery consistency. It was non-matted, non-tender. There was splenomegaly 3 centimeter below costal margin. Investigations just revealed mild leukopenia. Chest X-ray was normal.
So, Dr. Sridhar, would you like to comment on the slide, please?
Yeah. Picture what you is one large cells which has been brought out, so is seen in a background of similar looking smaller cells. What is that large cell is saying? Large cell is showing 3 lobes of the nuclei. You can see almost in the center like a owl's eye, like big macronuclei. This is a typical description of what you call as a Reed-Sternberg cell. Nowadays,
so sir's voice is not very clear, but I think he is pointing towards this Reed-Sternberg cell in the center of the slide. And this is again the image of the classical RS cell. And I think we have a CD30 positivity in this case. And again, a CD30 patchy positivity in some areas and CD3 positivity in the background. So sir, I think there is some network issue. There is some network issue. So this particular case was reported as a classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, mixed cellularity type. So this was a mixed cellularity Hodgkin lymphoma. And I'll move further with that. And a PET scan was done. Vineet, would you like to comment on the PET scan and then we'll talk about the staging?
Yeah. Now, if we see this PET scan, again, there is a very large nodal mass, which I can see in the left cervical region. And there are multiple other abdominal and retroperitoneal lymph nodes. There is nodes in the mediastinum. And if we see the spleen is enlarged also. And there are multiple lesions within the spleen. So this is splenic involvement. And if we can, so multiple large cervical lymph nodes, but none of them is looking more than 6 centimeters. There are individual nodes. They are discrete nodes. So none of them is more than 6 centimeters, but we have multiple splenic lesions. We have both sides of the diaphragm lesions. And in this image, I can't see any obvious, I think there is no bony lesion as such discrete.
So the bone marrow aspiration, Pallavi, would you like to take from there?
Bone marrow aspiration and bilateral biopsy showed no involvement, but there was a iliac bone lesion in PET CT which had SUV of 3.2. And also we were told that in PET CT there is a lymph node mass in the cervical region which is measuring more than 6 centimeters. So we took it as bulky disease and stage 4 because there was above and below diaphragm disease. And there was iliac bone lesion, which was non-contiguous lesion and splenic involvement also. So we took it as stage 4 and B symptoms because he had history of fever and bulky disease, as I told, based upon the PET CT. So this child was started on ABVD chemotherapy, received 2 cycles of ABVD and then early response assessment PET was done.
Vineet, would you like to comment?
Yeah. Now this is very nice case. If we see the CT and PET images both, we can clearly see there are some residual cervical lymph node present on the left side. These lymph nodes are still FDG avid, but as compared to the previous, the FDG uptake is definitely less. So according to dual criteria, it is 4 or 5. There is definitely a size-based response. So it is partial response in which more than 50% size reduction is there. So it is a partial response, but there is a residual disease. Dual score 4 or 5 is there. I think it is dual 5. Yeah.
So this child had extensive disease elsewhere also, but everything else has disappeared. But this cervical node still persists to be dual score 5. The iliac lesion completely disappeared, which was the one with the SUV of 3.2 with the treatment, and abdominal nodes also showed a metabolic CR, and spleen had no FDG avidity. So as Vineet pointed out, this was taken as a partial response, because the definition of which is that at sites where the FDG PET scan was positive before therapy, the post-treatment PET is positive at one or more of those previously known slides. So after 4 ABVD, the PET scan was repeated again. Vineet, would you like to comment on that? This is after 4 ABVD, and as per the INCOG study, this patient was expected to go, was hoped to go into a complete CR so that, he can be on the same treatment. But what is happening in this is?
See, for a CR, the lesion should completely go on the CT image. For a PET image, the uptake should not be there. But if we again see those cervical lymph nodes, they are still FDG avid. Dual score criteria is more than 5. And if we see from the compare, the uptake has definitely increased. The size also appears to be, I think, if we can see it in the axial. Yeah, the size also appears to have increased from that, and it's more than 50% increase in the SPD of the lesion. So it's a dual 5, and it seems to be progressive.
So as rightly pointed out, this is dual score 5, and the size is actually increased. It was called as a stable disease, but if you really look at the definition, if there is a 50% increase in the size of the product of the perpendicular diameters, this should be called as a progressive disease, and we'll see what happens to this. Pallavi, do you want to just finish this?
So
Manas may interpret here. Sorry, interrupt here. I'm sorry. The response criteria which you just mentioned, just for the students who have logged in, that wouldn't be the whole disease process itself, or you will go as per the site. Because other sites have responded very well. So why would you call it not stable, and you'll call it
so
progressive
you are
disease?
Expected to be in a complete metabolic CR in your entire body. All your lesions have
complete. I understand. I think the comment was on stable versus progressive, because you said there's more than 50%.
So that is why we called it. That is why we called it stable disease. Although if we look at the exact definition of progressive disease, which I'm going to show at the end, even any area, if there is an increase in the size or FDG avidity, which you are sure is lymphomatous, it is a progressive disease, because the patient is still on treatment, and if one area is progressing, eventually he may progress to any other area. So I don't know if Badira or Dr. Rachna think otherwise, but that is what exactly the definition is for progressive disease.
So as you pointed out, Dr. Sunil, if your other lesions are responding very good and you have one lesion which is progressing, so that even when it fits in the criteria of progressive disease, to make a confirmatory progressive disease, you have to biopsy that level.
Biopsy that area.
Yes. Biopsy it, yes.
Yeah. So that you prove that it's definitely lymphomatic.
Responded.
Or if there was any new site
has previously responded, and only this lesion was remaining.
Yeah, so this is the site which is the site for the clinical trouble right from the beginning. And even when this child was on follow-up, even after 4 cycles of ABVD, he had a very big lump in his neck with a very high FDG avidity. So we kind of assumed that this was the site of the disease. This child was given gemcitabine and vinorelbine therapy, and despite that, the FDG avidity of that site was high. And actually, after 4 cycles of GV, I'll quickly finish it because of the lack of time, the SUV started going up, and new lesions started appearing in the abdominal area with big nodes and a SUV being 6. So at this point of time, this child was called as a progressive disease, and the PET helped us make that diagnosis. And if you have new lesions appearing, if you have progression of a non-measurable accessible disease, and on PET-CT there is presence of new FDG avid lesions, we have to be careful. We have to biopsy them and prove them, and especially if they are in the pulmonary area, because after a lot of chemotherapy, patient is predisposed for infections, and you have to be very sure that it is not tuberculosis or anything else before calling it as a progressive disease. And this is what happened for this patient.
Any inflammation can cause a high SUV. So differentiating a Purley lymphoma or infection based on that, it would require biopsy.
So in view of poor response, this child was started on ice, after which the node is clinically completely disappeared. Plan is to do a reassessment and an autologous transplant followed by radiotherapy for this patient. So we would just like to conclude by saying that diagnosis and staging of Hodgkin needs a good history, a careful observation and examination, discussion with the pathologist, and inputs from the nuclear medicine physician at every step of assessment, so that we can have a good outcome for our patient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manas, and the all faculty. I think it was a very interesting session. Very basic concepts. I think we tried to clear. I think from the question point of view, we tried to address what was put on the chat simultaneously. But if there's any questions from anyone, I think the faculty and the experts will be very glad to answer those. So anyone with a question, you can speak up or you can chat, and then we can ask the experts. I think Shirisha has put a question that was this biopsy, this lymph node before calling it. I think you partly answered that, Manas, that, and I think it's discussed. Someone has put role of rituximab in Hodgkin's lymphoma, although it's not in the scope of today's discussion, but still, I think if someone wants to get going with that question.
Yeah. So in Hodgkin's, so as already previously pointed out, in classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, CD20 is expressed only in about 20% of the patients. It's usually seen in NLPHL, where rituximab usually there is the role. But if you have a refractory Hodgkin's lymphoma where you don't have the provisions to get other therapy, brentuximab or other thing, refractory, and it's not responding, and if you find on IHC that it is CD20 positive, which as I said happens in around 20 to 30% of the classical Hodgkin's lymphoma, maybe there is a case to use rituximab in such cases. Otherwise, no.
So is there a cutoff of how many cells have to be positive that that we can use rituximab?
Yes, so when they say on IHC you have CD20 positivity, it is based on the cutoff of this much amount of cells have more than 10%, something like that. There is a 15 or 10 cutoff which has CD20.
Okay, any other questions? Well, so thank you very much. I think we should conclude today's session now. And I again thanks all the experts, faculty for getting some time out of their busy schedule and sharing some experiences with us today. Before we I think leave, I request everyone to put the feedback. Take some time to fill the feedback form. It won't take more than 2 minutes. It's important for us to plan for the sessions. So with that, we'll close the meeting. I will see you again next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.